The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
For decades, the story of ABBA has been told through glitter and glamour. Four figures in sequin jumpsuits conquering the world with melodies that seemed to pour out of them effortlessly. The world bought the image. The world sang the songs. And the world assumed that behind every dazzling performance was a group of people living the kind of life their music promised, joyful, triumphant, and free. But now, at 78 years old, Benny Andersson is finally pulling back the curtain. And what he's revealing underneath is not the fairy tale the world thought it knew. It is something far more honest, far more complicated, and ultimately, far more human. Today, we explore the truth that Benny has carried for decades, the hidden story behind the music, the silence behind the smiles, and the confession that changes everything we thought we understood about one of the greatest bands in history. Long before there was ABBA, there was a boy in Sweden who heard the world in melodies. Benny Andersson did not grow up dreaming of stadium crowds or gold records. He grew up sitting beside accordions and listening to folk songs that carried the weight of generations. The music he absorbed in those early years was not meant to entertain, it was meant to express something that ordinary language could never quite reach. It carried grief and celebration in the same breath. It understood that life was rarely one thing or another, but almost always both at once. That early education in emotional complexity became the foundation of everything Benny would later build. By the time he was a teenager, he had already developed an instinct for the kind of music that lived beneath the surface of simple chord progressions, music that appeared light on the outside but carried something weightier inside. He was not thinking about pop stardom. He was thinking about feeling. He was chasing the moment when a melody suddenly made something that had no words finally feel understood. This is important to understand because it explains so much of what ABBA would become. When Benny eventually joined forces with Björn Ulvaeus to form the creative engine behind the group, he did not approach their work as a commercial exercise. For Benny, every song was an attempt to capture something real, an emotion, a tension, a quiet truth that most people were too busy or too scared to look at directly. He believed deeply that music had the power to say what people could not bring themselves to say aloud. That belief drove him into the studio day after day, pushing and reworking and refining until the music matched the feeling he was reaching for. Sometimes that process took hours. Sometimes it took days. But Benny was never in a hurry when the work was honest. What made him unusual among pop composers of his era was precisely this refusal to settle for surface-level emotion. In an industry built on hooks and radio-friendly formulas, Benny was doing something quietly radical. He was layering sadness into upbeat arrangements. He was building tension into moments that sounded like release. He understood, perhaps better than anyone around him, that the most powerful music does not choose between joy and sorrow, it holds them both simultaneously. And that tension, invisible to most listeners but felt by everyone, is what made ABBA's songs impossible to shake. There is a familiar image of ABBA that the world has always carried, two radiant women at the front of the stage, voices soaring, commanding the attention of arenas and living rooms across the globe. And behind them, somewhat further from the light, two men whose contribution was enormous but whose faces were somehow less famous. For Björn, this was a matter of personality. But for Benny, it was something more complicated. It was the particular loneliness of being the person who builds the house and then watches everyone else move in. Benny has spoken in recent years about how he processed the reality of being ABBA's central musical architect while rarely being recognized as such. Fans knew his name. Insiders respected his talent. But the cultural story of ABBA was never really his story. It was the story of the voices, the performances, the visual spectacle. Benny existed behind the glass of the recording booth, adjusting harmonies and restructuring arrangements while the world focused on what the microphones captured. He made the music that made the singers sound extraordinary. And then, when the applause came, it traveled to the front of the stage and stopped there. This is not a complaint Benny has voiced with bitterness. By his own account, he was never chasing the spotlight in that conventional sense. What he wanted was something more specific and, in some ways, more difficult to obtain than fame. He wanted to be understood. He wanted people to hear what he was actually doing inside those songs, the deliberate choices, the emotional architecture, the moments where he held back a melody to let silence do the work. He wanted someone to notice that what sounded effortless had cost him considerably. For years, critics described ABBA's music as polished pop entertainment, catchy, well-produced, enjoyable. And those descriptions, though not wrong, missed what Benny considered the entire point. He was not making entertainment. He was making confessions. He was taking the emotions he could not navigate in his daily life and finding ways to encode them in chord progressions and key changes. Every song was a version of something he was feeling and could not yet say. And when the world listened to those songs and called them catchy, something in Benny quietly grieved the distance between what he had put in and what had been received. The relationship between Benny and Frida, Anna-Frid Lyngstad, was one of the most significant of his life, and also one of the most revealing about the way Benny moved through the world. They found each other in music before they found each other in any other sense. The late nights in the studio, the shared language of melody and arrangement, the way a song could communicate what a conversation could not, all of this drew them together in ways that felt profound and real. And it was. But it was also incomplete. Frida was a person who felt things intensely and needed that intensity to be met. She lived in her emotions openly and brought that full emotional presence to everything she did, including her relationship with Benny. Benny, by contrast, had spent his entire life learning to root his feelings through music rather than through direct human contact. He was not cold. He was not indifferent. But he had built such a sophisticated internal language for processing emotion that the direct, unmediated version, the kind a relationship requires, was genuinely difficult for him. What happened between them was not a story of cruelty or betrayal. It was something quieter and in some ways more heartbreaking. Benny gave Frida his best emotional work. He gave it to the songs. He poured the tenderness, the longing, the vulnerability, the love into the music, and then found himself empty when the session was over and the real conversation needed to happen. Frida needed the person sitting across from her at the kitchen table. She needed the emotion that wasn't wrapped in a melody. And Benny, for all his extraordinary sensitivity as an artist, had not yet learned how to offer that. He has acknowledged this in recent years with a kind of honesty that is quietly devastating. He understands now that the music was not just his creative outlet, it was also a way of managing distance. It gave him the feeling of being emotionally present without requiring the vulnerability that true presence demands. He could write a song about longing without having to actually sit with longing. He could compose a melody about loss without having to face it directly. The music was a container for everything he could not bear to hold in his hands. And so the relationship, for all its genuine connection and shared history, eventually gave way under the weight of that imbalance. Not dramatically. Not with a defining confrontation. But slowly, the way things tend to end when the people involved are too kind, or too lost, or too much inside their own inner worlds to find their way back to each other. Inside the private dynamics of ABBA, Benny occupied a role that was never officially assigned to him but which he somehow ended up filling by default. He was the stabilizer. When creative tensions rose between bandmates, Benny was the one who found a way to redirect the energy back into the work. When the emotional temperature in the studio climbed too high, he lowered it, not by addressing the conflict directly, but by returning everyone's attention to the music. He kept things moving. He kept things functional. And in doing so, he quietly absorbed more than his share of the group's collective stress. This role, the person who holds everything together so that everyone else can fall apart a little, is an exhausting one. And it is particularly exhausting for someone who is already using enormous emotional resources just to keep their own inner world in order. Benny was managing the music, managing the group's creative health, managing his own emotional complexity, and managing his relationship with Frida, all simultaneously, all while projecting the calm, focused exterior that his role required. The pressure was immense. And because he processed it all internally rather than expressing it outwardly, it accumulated without any clear release. By the late years of ABBA's active life, Benny has admitted that what kept him there was no longer passion. It was something heavier, a sense of obligation, a guilt about the idea of being the one to step away from something that so many people depended on. He stayed because leaving felt irresponsible. He stayed because he had helped build something of enormous cultural significance and could not bring himself to be the reason it ended. He stayed, even as the creative fire that had once made the work feel necessary and alive gradually dimmed to something that felt more like obligation than inspiration. This confession reframes everything about ABBA's later period. The music they made during those final years was still extraordinary by most standards. But Benny now describes making it as fundamentally different from the early work: less discovery, more maintenance. Less a pursuit of something true, more an attempt to meet expectations that had become impossible to fully satisfy. The joy had not disappeared entirely, but it had changed its nature. And for someone who had always created out of genuine emotional need, making music out of duty felt like a kind of hollowness that no amount of commercial success could fill. ABBA did not end with a fight. There was no defining moment, no dramatic confrontation, no meeting where four people looked at each other and agreed it was over. Instead, it ended the way Benny describes so many of the most significant things in his life: quietly, gradually, without ceremony. The music simply stopped feeling necessary. The sessions that had once felt urgent and alive began to feel routine. The emotional engine that had powered everything they made together ran out of fuel, not all at once, but in increments, each session a little less alive than the one before. Benny has reflected on how strange it was that a band of their magnitude, a group that had reshaped global pop culture and sold hundreds of millions of records, simply drifted apart without a formal conclusion. There were no goodbyes that felt adequate to the scale of what they had shared. People went in separate directions. Projects diverged. And the silence that followed was not peaceful, it was unresolved. It sat in Benny for years, a loose end he did not know how to tie. The public, of course, wanted a story. They wanted drama, scandal, a villain, a moment of spectacular collapse. The reality offered none of these things. It offered only the quiet, unglamorous truth that four people who had given everything to a shared project had simply reached the end of what they had to give. They had poured themselves into the music with such totality that there was nothing left for the music to draw from. And when the well ran dry, the only honest thing left to do was stop. For Benny, this period after ABBA was among the most difficult of his life, not because of external chaos, but because of the internal reckoning it forced. He had to face, for the first time without the buffer of constant creative work, the accumulated weight of everything he had not processed. The emotions he had written into songs rather than speaking aloud. The conversations he had avoided by returning to the piano. The relationships he had loved imperfectly. All of it was waiting for him in the quiet.